The bombers came from nowhere. That was what the pilots said when they landed, their faces pale beneath leather helmets, their hands still shaking on throttles that no longer responded to fear. They had climbed to 12,000 feet, exactly where ground control had sent them, and found only clouds and the distant murmur of engines that should have been directly ahead. 50 kilometers south, the city of Essen burned. Major Werner Hartmann stood on the frozen runway of Luftwaffe night fighter base St. Dizier, watching his squadron taxi in from another failed intercept. November 1943 had been the worst month of his career. 3 missions. 3 times the British had simply vanished from where they were supposed to be. His pilots whispered that the enemy could see in the dark. Hartmann was beginning to think they were right, that he had joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, full of confidence and the certainty that German engineering would always triumph. By 1940, he was an ace, hunting British bombers over the channel with the precision of a surgeon. His Messerschmitt Bf 110 had become an extension of his body, the Liechtenstein radar a sixth sense that let him find prey in absolute darkness. He had believed, truly believed, that technology and skill would win any war. Now he believed in ghosts. Lieutenant Klaus Brenner climbed down from the aircraft behind him, his face drawn with exhaustion. Brenner was not a pilot. He was a radar operator, a former mathematics professor from Heidelberg who had been conscripted into service when the war demanded men who understood radio waves. He carried a leather journal everywhere, filled with calculations and timestamps that no one else could read. Nothing, Hartmann said. It was not a question. Brenner shook his head. Ground control gave us coordinates based on the Himmelbett system. The chain home stations tracked the bomber stream crossing the coast. Everything was correct. Except the bombers were not there. The Himmelbett system was supposed to be Germany's answer to the night raids. A network of radar stations divided the sky into boxes, each one monitored by a controller who could vector fighters directly onto incoming aircraft. It had worked brilliantly in 1942. Now it failed more often than it succeeded, and no one could explain why. Colonel Friedrich Stahl was waiting for them in the operations building, his uniform immaculate despite the hour. Stahl had flown in the Spanish Civil War, had dropped bombs on Guernica, had watched cities burn from above. Nothing surprised him anymore except failure. Berlin wants answers, he said without greeting. Reichsmarshal Göring himself has demanded to know why our interception rates have fallen by 60%. Hartmann felt his jaw tighten. The enemy changes their routes. They fly lower, higher, in different formations. Our intelligence is always one step behind. Then our intelligence has a leak. Stahl's voice was cold. Someone is telling them where we will be. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Brenner shifted uncomfortably beside Hartmann. They both knew what happened to men accused of treason in the Third Reich. The Gestapo did not require evidence, only suspicion. Later that night, Hartmann sat alone in his quarters, reading a letter from his wife in Munich. She wrote about their daughter's 6th birthday, about the rationing that made cake impossible, about the neighbors who had lost their son over Stalingrad. She wrote about hope, about faith in final victory, about the day he would come home. That he read it 3 times, then burned it in the small iron stove. He could not let her know that he had stopped believing. Not in Germany, not in the war, but in the fundamental nature of combat itself. An enemy you could not see, could not predict, could not outmaneuver was not an enemy at all. It was a force of nature. A knock came at his door just after midnight. Brenner stood in the hallway, his leather journal clutched to his chest like a shield. "I need to show you something," he said quietly. "Not here. Outside." They walked to the edge of the runway, far from any building where listeners might hide. The stars above were sharp and cold, indifferent to the war beneath them. Brenner opened his journal and pointed to a page covered in numbers. "I have been tracking every failed intercept for 3 months. The pattern is undeniable. Every time we receive coordinates by radio, the enemy knows exactly where we will be. Every time we change plans at the last moment, using only landline communication, we succeed." Hartmann stared at him. "That is impossible." Our communications are encrypted. The Enigma machine is unbreakable. Brenner's eyes were hollow. Major, if I am right, then every order transmitted by radio is being read by the British. Every convoy route, every flight plan, every scramble command. They do not predict our paths. They know them in advance. In the distance, air raid sirens began to wail. Another raid was coming. Another night of hunting ghosts. Hartmann looked at the mathematician and saw his own fear reflected back. Tell no one, he said. Not until we know for certain. But certainty, he was beginning to understand, was the first casualty of this invisible war. 600 kilometers away, in a manor house surrounded by English countryside, a young woman plotted the death of men she would never meet. Section Officer Margaret Shaw stood before a massive glass screen at RAF Bentley Priory, pushing wooden markers across a map of occupied Europe with a long-handled rake. Each marker represented a German aircraft. Each movement she made helped bombers slip through the darkness unseen. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force had taught her to read radar returns, to calculate interception angles, to understand the invisible geometry of aerial combat. What they had not taught her was how to sleep afterward. She knew that every successful raid meant German pilots circling empty sky, their fuel running low, their confusion growing. She told herself they were the enemy. It did not always help that in France, Lieutenant Klaus Brenner had stopped sleeping entirely. His small room in the base's administrative building had become a shrine to obsession. Charts covered every wall. Colored threads connected timestamps to mission reports to radio intercept logs. His wife had stopped writing, he had stopped answering weeks ago. There was no room in his mind for anything except the pattern that was slowly revealing itself. The British were reading everything that he had confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. Missions coordinated by radio failed. Missions coordinated by landline or personal briefing succeeded. The correlation was 93% over 47 missions. In mathematics, that was not coincidence. It was proof, but proof meant nothing in Nazi Germany. Proof meant questioning the infallibility of German engineering. Proof meant suggesting that the enemy was smarter, more capable, more dangerous than the propaganda admitted. Proof could get a man killed. Hauptmann Victor Roth arrived at the base on a gray December morning, his black leather coat marking him as Gestapo before he even spoke. He was young for his rank, barely 30, with the careful eyes of a man who had learned to see treachery everywhere. The war had made him. It had also hollowed him out. I am here to investigate security failures, he announced to Colonel Stahl. Berlin believes there may be enemy agents operating within your command structure. Stahl accepted this with the resignation of a man who had seen too many investigations. My men are loyal. Loyalty is easily performed, Roth replied. I prefer evidence. The interrogations began that afternoon. Roth started with the radio operators, the men who handled the most sensitive communications. He asked about their families, their politics, their friends abroad. He wrote everything in a small notebook with handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. Hartmann watched from across the base as one of his ground crew, a young corporal named Weber whose only crime was having a brother in Switzerland, was escorted to Roth's office. The man's face was white with fear. Everyone knew what happened in those rooms. Everyone pretended not to know. That night, Brenner came to Hartmann with his evidence. They met in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by aircraft in various states of repair, where the noise of generators would mask their voices. Look at this, Brenner whispered, spreading his charts across a workbench. December 3rd, mission to intercept bombers over Cologne. Radio coordination. Failure. December 7th, mission to defend the Ruhr. Landline coordination only. For confirmed kills. December 12th, return to radio coordination. Complete failure. The bombers were not even in the sector. Hartmann studied the numbers. He was a pilot, not a mathematician, but even he could see the pattern. If you show this to Stahl, he will have you arrested. I know. If you show it to Roth, he will have you shot. I know that too. Brenner's hands were trembling. But if I say nothing, how many more men die? How many more cities burn because we are chasing ghosts? Hartmann thought of Weber, the corporal with the Swiss brother. He thought of his own wife in Munich, waiting for a husband who might never return. He thought of the pilots he had trained, young men who trusted him to lead them into battle, not into ambush. "Give me time," he said finally. "Let me think." But there was no time. The next morning, Weber was taken away in a staff car with blackened windows. He did not return. That afternoon, Roth summoned Brenner for questioning. Hartmann stood on the runway and watched his friend walk toward the administrative building. Brenner moved like a man approaching his own execution, slow and deliberate, his leather journal still clutched in his hands. At the door, he turned and looked back, their eyes met across the frozen ground. Brenner nodded once, then disappeared inside. 2 hours later, the sirens wailed. Another mission. Another hunt for ghosts. Hartmann climbed into his aircraft and took off into the winter sky, knowing that somewhere below, a mathematician was being broken for the crime of understanding too much. The cell was cold, but Klaus Brenner had stopped noticing. 3 days of interrogation had reduced the world to simple categories: pain and not pain, questions and silence, the slow grinding certainty that truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Roth had not believed him. Roth had believed in traitors, in saboteurs, in enemies within. The idea that British intelligence could read German communications was too vast, too terrifying to accept. So Brenner sat in darkness and waited to disappear. 500 meters away, Werner Hartmann made a decision that would define everything that followed. He gathered his 4 most trusted pilots in the briefing room after midnight, when the base was quiet and Roth's men were occupied elsewhere. He locked the door and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight we fly without the radio." The pilots stared at him. Flying without radio coordination was madness. The entire German night fighter system depended on ground control vectoring aircraft toward their targets. Without that guidance, they would be blind. "Trust me," Hartmann said. "I have coordinates. Real coordinates. We fly in formation, maintain visual contact, follow my lead. No radio communication until we engage." He had obtained the intelligence through channels he would never reveal, a contact in the Signals Corps who owed him a favor from before the war. The British bomber stream would cross the French coast at 2,300 hours, heading for Stuttgart. This time, the information had never touched a radio transmitter. They took off into a moonless night, for aircraft flying in tight formation, guided only by exhaust flames and Hartmann's navigation. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was not designed for formation flying in darkness. Every second carried the risk of collision, of losing visual contact, of spiraling into the frozen earth below. At 23:15, they found the bombers. The Lancaster stream stretched across the sky like a river of steel, hundreds of aircraft flying in defensive boxes, their gunners scanning for threats. Hartmann's squadron hit them from above and behind, exactly where the British least expected attack. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 4 bombers were falling in flames, and Hartmann's squadron had not lost a single aircraft. They landed to find the base in stunned silence. Colonel Stahl was waiting on the runway, his face unreadable. "How?" he asked. "Luck," Hartmann lied. "We found a gap in their formation." Stahl did not believe him. Neither did anyone else. But the kill reports were undeniable, and in a war of diminishing returns, for confirmed victories meant something. For one night, at least, the ghosts had become solid. In her quarters at Bentley Priory, Margaret Shaw noted the anomaly immediately. Her logs showed a successful German interception with no preceding radio chatter. No ground control vectors. No coordination signals. Just 4 fighters appearing exactly where they should not have been. She filed her report with a note of concern. If the Germans had discovered that their communications were compromised, the entire ultra-intelligence network could be at risk. At Bletchley Park, analysts began studying the incident with the intensity of surgeons examining a tumor. Hartmann visited Brenner that night, bribing the guard with cigarettes and promises. The mathematician sat against the cell wall, his face bruised, his spectacles cracked, but his eyes still sharp with the clarity of a man who understood patterns. "You tested it," Brenner said. "Yes. It worked. 4 kills. No losses." Brenner closed his eyes. "Then you know the truth. Every radio transmission is compromised. The Enigma machine, the codes, all of it. They can read everything we send." Hartmann crouched beside him. "Can you prove it?" "Not to Roth. To someone who matters. I could, if I had access to my notes. If I had time." Brenner opened his eyes. "But Roth does not want proof. He wants a confession. He wants someone to blame." The next morning, news arrived that changed everything. Allied bombers had struck a synthetic oil facility in Bremen with devastating precision. The Luftwaffe had scrambled every available fighter, following radio coordinates that led them to empty sky. While they searched, the bombers had taken a different route entirely. 37 aircraft lost. 216 men dead. And somewhere in Britain, intelligence officers were celebrating another successful deception. Colonel Stahl summoned Hartmann to his office. "Tell me how you did it," he said. "Tell me why your mission succeeded when every other mission fails." Hartmann looked at his commanding officer, at the medals on his chest, at the weariness in his eyes. He thought about Brenner in his cell, about Weber who had vanished, about all the men who had died chasing shadows. "Radio silence," he said finally. "We did not use the radio. Not once." Stahl's face went pale. "You are suggesting, I am suggesting nothing, Herr Oberst. I am telling you what I did and what happened. Draw your own conclusions." The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Outside, engines roared as another squadron prepared for another mission. Another hunt for ghosts. Another failure waiting to happen. "Brenner," Stahl said quietly. "The mathematician. He told you this. He showed me the pattern. I tested it. The pattern held." Stahl walked to his window and stared at the runway. "If you are right, then everything we have built is compromised. Every order, every plan, every secret. Berlin will never accept it." "No," Hartmann agreed. "They will not." "Then what do you propose?" Hartmann thought of his wife in Munich, of his daughter who would turn 7 without him, of all the men who trusted him to lead them through the darkness. "I propose we stop talking," he said, "and start fighting a different kind of war." Spring came to France like a held breath finally released. The ice melted. The days grew longer. And somewhere across the channel, thousands of ships and millions of men prepared for an invasion that would change the world. Werner Hartmann knew it was coming. Everyone knew. The only question was when and where, and that question had become Germany's obsession. Klaus Brenner was free. Not vindicated, not believed, simply released without explanation when Roth was recalled to Berlin for more important investigations. The mathematician returned to his duties with the hollow gratitude of a man who had glimpsed his own grave and stepped back from the edge. He did not speak of his time in the cell. Some knowledge was too heavy to share, but the pattern remained. And Hartmann had a plan. "We used their advantage against them," he explained to his pilots in the pre-dawn darkness. "If they can read our radio communications, then we tell them what we want them to hear. We broadcast false coordinates, false timing, false routes. They intercept the message and send their bombers accordingly. And we wait somewhere else entirely." It was deception layered upon deception, a hall of mirrors built from radio waves and carefully constructed lies. The British had been manipulating German movements for months. Now Hartmann would return the favor. The mission launched on a night thick with clouds and the distant rumble of artillery from the approaching front. Hartmann's squadron filed flight plans that would take them west toward the Channel approaches. Radio operators transmitted these plans using standard Enigma encryption, knowing with absolute certainty that the enemy would read every word. Then they flew east. The British bomber stream appeared exactly where Hartmann had predicted, following a corridor that their intelligence had marked as safe. They flew at 16,000 feet, confident that German fighters were chasing phantoms 100 kilometers away. They were wrong. Hartmann's attack came from the darkness above like the judgment of an angry god. His fighters dove through the formation, cannons blazing, tearing holes in the neat defensive boxes that Bomber Command had designed. The Lancaster crews fought back with desperate courage, tail gunners tracking targets through the chaos, but surprise had stolen their greatest weapon. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. 7 bombers went down in flames. Hartmann watched them fall, each one a cascade of burning fuel and doomed men, and felt nothing except the cold mathematics of survival. This was what war had become. Not glory or honor or the romance of knights jousting in the sky. Just numbers. Just patterns. Just death. His wingman died in the final minutes, a young pilot named Richter who had celebrated his 22nd birthday the week before. A tail gunner's lucky shot found his cockpit and turned him into a torch tumbling through the night. Hartmann heard his scream over the radio before the signal cut to static. They landed to cheers and congratulations. Colonel Stahl called it the greatest victory of the year. Berlin sent commendations. For one brief moment, it seemed like the tide might turn, but Hartmann knew better. He had won a battle by exploiting a trick that could never be repeated. The British would analyze tonight's failure. They would realize their intelligence had been manipulated. They would adapt, adjust, find new ways to read the invisible war. And Germany would fall further behind because the truth that Brenner had discovered could never be spoken aloud. The Enigma machine was broken. Every secret transmitted by radio belonged to the enemy. And no amount of individual courage could overcome that fundamental betrayal of trust that he found Brenner in the empty mess hall, nursing a cup of ersatz coffee that tasted like burned wood. The mathematician looked up with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. "I heard about tonight," Brenner said. 7 kills. They are calling you a hero. Richter is dead. I know. Brenner stared into his cup. I knew his father before the war. A baker in Cologne. His shop was destroyed in a raid last year. They sat in silence while the clock ticked and the night slowly surrendered to dawn. Outside, ground crews worked on damaged aircraft, their voices carrying through the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, marking an hour that felt like any other despite everything that had changed. Do you regret knowing? Brenner asked finally. The truth about the radios, about the codes. Do you wish you had never found out? Hartmann considered the question. He thought of all the missions that might have been different, all the pilots who might have lived if someone had discovered the breach earlier. He thought of his wife and daughter waiting in a country that was slowly being crushed between 2 unstoppable forces. He thought of the letter he had written and never sent, full of truths he could not speak. No, he said at last. A blind man is still blind. At least now I know why I cannot see. The sun rose over the airfield, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. In a few weeks, the invasion would come. The beaches would run red with blood. The air would fill with aircraft beyond counting. And men like Hartmann would fight and die in a war they could no longer win against an enemy they could no longer surprise. That he walked to his fighter and climbed into the cockpit one more time. The radio hummed with static, that quiet whisper of electrons carrying secrets across the sky. He understood now what that sound really meant. It was the voice of the future, speaking in a language that could not be unlearned. Above him, the sky waited. Infinite. Indifferent. Full of ghosts that finally had names, Hartmann started his engines and prepared to fly into history.